Hi. Hello. Hey
How are you?
Tara. I'm good. I'm good. A bit rainy here, so
Yeah,
working from home.
same. Yeah, same here in Melbourne. Yeah.
Yeah. Are you in Caesar right now?
Yeah, I am. Yeah.
Hey. Nice. Very
Yeah.
nice. So good to have you. Hey Rob. Hey Craig.
Hey, how are
Malton.
you?
Hey, how's it going?
Good,
Nice.
thanks. You?
Bye. Great. Really good. I'm actually super stoked for today. I've been waiting all of my SproutX career to for this debate discussion to happen because it's also something that I would love so much to learn more about. Alex, hello, Sky, Marianne, so good to have you with us today.
Hello, thanks for having me.
Hey, I feel like this would be a session that you'll really like.
I think so too.
Nice. All right, we've got a few latecomers. Ash, quick check in. Do you have? I'm gonna make you co-host so you can also have a peek at waiting room, so you can co-pilot. Okay. All right. Okay. Hello, hello. Again, another nice lunch and learn session. This time we've got the best brains working across the livestock and then the alt protein side of the, I guess, the feeding the population, how to feed it effectively, efficiently, and not to create too much of a burden on the environment. It's a lot. There's a lot to unpack, but we've been really chuffed to be able to get Georgia Sheil from Vow Foods with us today, dialing in from Sydney, and also Paul, who some of you would have met on the welcome drinks. But yeah, I mean, I don't want to take up too much oxygen. I feel like the experts would be in the best position to sort of like talk to some of the work they're doing, their career experience up to now, and then I would sort of guide them through a few questions. And as usual, if you have any questions you wanted to ask, just click on the, I'm just going to do it for the sake of some new faces here today. Just click this raise hand button over here. It will bump you to the very beginning, and then I will hand you the talking stick. There we go. So Georgia, Paul, thank you so much for being with us here today. I thought that would use the first questions to sort of like set the scene and open up a little bit on what you guys do. So can you talk a little bit about, I guess, the livestock farming? It's contributing to the wider farming environment and also the very, I think, quite recent huge attention around finding a better and alternative solution on nutrition and feeding the wider population. Georgia, if you like to kick off answering this very
Oh,
big question for us, that would be wonderful.
yeah, I'm absolutely happy to, Maxi. Did you want me to give a bit of an intro into my background to start with?
Yeah, 100% and
Is
vow
that
as well. Take this
is that
anywhere you like.
all right? Okay, everyone. Well, lovely to meet you all. Really looking forward to navigating this discussion with Paul. Just so you know, Paul and I have met before and had similar types of conversations at the VOUS, which is what we call our office here in Sydney. So looking forward to picking up some of those threads with you all here today. What I'll do is I'll just give you a little really high level background so you kind of get who I am, and then perhaps Paul, you might want to introduce yourself too, and then I'm happy to answer that question regarding the elements of livestock farming and contribution to wider environmental elements and sort of the call for cellular agriculture. So I'm happy to answer that. So um, I think up front, I am representing Val here today, but by no means am an expert. So I think that title really should go to my really intelligent team in R&D, manufacturing, and strategy back at the VOUS today. But I come with a background in civil engineering. About 5 years ago, transitioned into the agricultural space out of just a pure drive to want to be part of sustainable food systems, which at the time I didn't have a lot of actual exposure to what that meant on the ground. So I've spent the past 4 or 5 years working with primary industries on their research and development strategies, predominantly with the horticulture sector and tropical fruit industries. And then more recently working on agri-food innovation related projects with AgriFutures Australia and now transitioning over to an operations role within VOW to try and scale this exciting innovation around cellular agriculture. So that's a little bit about me. Paul, did you want to give a bit of background?
Yeah, no, happy to. So I've been an R&D guy all of my career, which is a bit longer than most of you guys. You can see from the grey hair. So I did my PhD in immunology back in, I finished in 85 at the ANU. I entered into the sort of, I suppose, the ag space when I joined CSIRO in 1985, working on tuberculosis in cattle. And that's probably where I made my name. I discovered something useful, and then that went to be commercialized and is now a sort of standard of care for TB diagnosis around the world. So that sort of started my journey. CRCs came along. So I was the deputy director of a CRC for a decade. Eventually made the move across from CSIRO to CSL to head up their R&D for their animal health division and eventually their biosciences division as well. And then, as it is with companies, you get bought and sold a few times. So the animal health division was sold to Pfizer in 2004. And eventually I ended up in the US as head of global discovery in a place called Kalamazoo, Michigan, which is actually where the Pfizer made its COVID vaccine. It's one of its biggest plants there in Kalamazoo. So then, after that period in corporate life, as an R&D guy, pretty good fun because you've got shitloads of money and people to do lots of fun things. Came back to Australia and then went into the startup world with a couple of different ventures. So I'm probably on to my third one now, as chair of a company called Viridian, which is an insect protein company. And then I sit on various boards. So the Dairy Australia board, one that's pretty relevant to our discussion here is called GALVMED, Global Alliance for Veterinary Medicine. So that's out of the UK, and we work with smallholder farmers in Africa and India, and it's funded through the Gates Foundation. So it's very topical when we get into discussion as to, you've got to look at our food systems on a global basis. And often people don't quite understand that global nature of the agriculture or the food system. So that's probably enough from me. And yeah, Georgie, happy to hand back to you.
Fantastic. And I should have said before, actually, when I referred to experts, I'd say, Paul's obviously based on everything he's just said, definitely falls into that category as well. So awesome to be on a panel with you, Paul. Okay, so coming back to the topic at hand. So let me dive into and unpack for you as best I can. And I'd love to, welcome questions as we go along. And obviously, Paul, please build on some of the, I guess, key points that I raised. But the question posed is really around exploring livestock farming and its contribution to wider to the wider farming environment. And this mass call, I suppose, for a better alternative, and just unpacking that a little bit for everyone from our perspective. So I think it's worthwhile looking at this from a few angles. So one being the statistics, I guess, around global meat consumption today versus what we need in the future. So first things first is really that meat is delicious. It's the reason that everywhere in the world consumption is growing, and it is growing rapidly. So as GDP grows, we know that meat consumption reliably grows alongside it. And right now, for example, in the US, from a dollar sales of animal meat perspective, we're seeing 10 times faster growth than, say, plant-based meat alternatives. So that's sort of like a look at the demand side. But when it comes to actual production, in the past 50 years, meat production has more than tripled. So we're looking at roughly data from 2021, just under shy of 340 million tonnes of meat was produced globally, or at least that's the best data I have at hand, which is up by about 5% from 2020. And we're looking to see that demand for animal-derived protein to double again by 2050, predominantly due to global populations expecting to grow by over a third. And I think Paul made a really good point before. It's really important to call out there that nearly all of this growth is forecast to take place in developing countries, with a significant amount of growth in African nations. So that's the high level around statistics of global meat consumption today and where it's going. Then there's the element of the impact, or the resource costs for production of those resources, or those nutritional inputs of protein. So we know from a lot of analysis that's been done that meat production is accountable for 14.5 roughly % of global greenhouse gas emissions, but it's important to consider that this is compounded by increased demand for animal-based protein and the intensifying pressure on land use. So there's elements around global greenhouse gas emissions, but then there's the external sort of halo effects of land use, which in turn sort of increases the conversion of what would otherwise be wild assets, forests, wetlands, etc., grasslands, into agricultural lands, either for the use of actual grazing or for the use of growing fodder and feed. So I guess that's why alternatives to animal production to complement what we're already doing has become a high priority by way of wanting to explore cellular agriculture. There are other alternatives, which I know we'll explore in further discussion, but one of the possible alternatives to be explored is cellular agriculture. So I guess when you add in current demand, projected demand, environmental impact, I guess these things don't really add up when we look at the finite resources that we have. So that's where innovation really comes into play. And I'd suppose that's the way that we talk about it at VOW, and the way that we look at the value and the potential opportunity of cellular agriculture. Yeah, happy to, I think that's probably enough on that topic,
Yeah.
Maxie.
No, that's great. And I guess to sort of give everyone sort of a bit of signposting, another purpose of this session as well is just to understand, I guess, where these innovations Georgia has mentioned has clustered, and also, you know, like the attraction or the lure of wanting to find this very quick silver bullet that will just like quickly solve everything. Definitely do want to also unpack together with Georgia and Paul on just also other things that make sense to address all of these wider issues that Georgia has just mentioned. So Paul, I guess from your POV, looking at the current alternative solutions to meat protein, and obviously all the other tag along issues that follows. Do you like how do these solutions stack up to you so far? Like, is there an end goal? Is there good substitutes, or is it just kind of like a very far achieving good intention, but kind of like unpractical to get towards? So, can you perhaps share some of your views on this space as well?
Yeah, look, I mean, I support the open marketplace, so there's a lot of alternatives around there. I probably disagree a little bit on some of the figures.
Yeah.
And one of the things we got to be very careful about is often people will make statements about agriculture as if there's one system, and they're clearly not. So when if you just pick on one of those figures, if you look at meat, the growth in meat, yes, in meat, but it's actually not in red meat. So the actual figures on red meat consumption have been falling for several decades now in Australia, in the US. So what we're seeing is the rise of cheaper meat, so chicken in particular, and it varies across the globe. So, if you go to Japan, most of the animal protein is fish, not surprising. If you go to China, it's mostly pork, because China has 50% of the pigs in the world are in China. So there's some really differences about food, and that's a really fascinating thing about food. There's so many different aspects of food: social aspects, cultural aspects, nutritional aspects. But you do have to get, I would say, when we get down to some of these arguments, global figures really don't help a lot, because the food systems are so different. across the globe. So yeah, in the Western countries, we can probably afford to eat less animal protein, but generally we can afford to eat less of everything. People like to pick on the US. I was back in the US in July, and you know, the morbidity, it's sort of like, you know, when you get old like me, we're all a bit podgy, but seeing the obesity in young kids and teenagers, we're talking about morbid obesity. Every time I go back, it just scares me. And a lot of that is actually just poor diet. It's too many calories. It's too much sugar. Very hard to find any product in the States that doesn't have sugar in it, including bread. So that's a really interesting, you know, debate. We can probably, it's a bit of a sideline for today, but this whole issue about the you know, on one hand, we've got 2 billion people who don't have enough food, and then we've got another 2 billion who eat too much. And it's actually not because they don't understand. So if any of you are interested, I grabbed it off the shelf. Any of you interested in picking apart that one, try this book. This guy's Jack Bobo, Why Smart People Make Bad Food Choices. This is a really good book about food, particularly probably more Western focused, but it talks about some of these issues about why have we got ourselves in the mess that we're in the West, largely in the Western society, I'd say it. And it's not because we don't know. It's just, and again, there's a book that explains it better than me. It's we can't help ourselves. We just make dumb choices on a regular basis. So that's the first thing. So let's go to ag. So, you know, if you look at you know, agriculture in Africa and Asia, then a lot of that consumption, when we talk about animal proteins, is dairy, because often they can't afford to eat their animals. They're too valuable. 25% of their draft power comes from livestock, 25% of their manure to grow their crops. So, you know, those animals are pretty precious. You generally, if you're going to eat, you eat the small ruminants, the sort of goats and a few straggly sheep. And then poultry, you know, particularly village chickens, you know, a very different product. So if you don't know about chickens, the chicken that's on your table is 6 weeks old. That nice plump chicken. The village chicken generally is harvested about 18 months old, and it weighs less than that chicken that's on your table. So there's, again, a lot of issues about why that's the case. So I think one of the troubles we get into in food is using global figures, because they hide so much. Why do we need more protein in those countries? Well, we've got micronutrient deficiency. So we've got about 150 million children a year with a micronutrient deficiency because they didn't get key amino acids during that first 5 years of their life, and they won't recover. So it's not like they're a bit skinny and then you feed them up. Because they didn't have the right micronutrients, they didn't develop properly. So they'll be runted and stunted for their life. You can cure that with an egg a day, a glass of milk a day would actually do that. So that's why we need so much more animal protein in those countries. And in the Western world, we probably can afford to eat less, but it'll probably be higher quality. So what we're seeing, if you look at, say, the red meat industry in Australia, they're making a killing. I mean, the red meat industry as our export is huge, because we're seeing higher quality products. And it's actually a challenge for the rest of us. You know, if I put my dairy hat on, as a dairy farm comes up for sale, most of them are being bought and converted to beef and sheep. So our dairy production in Australia is getting lower because we're seeing people step out of dairy and convert to beef and sheep because the prices are really good. Price for dairy is great at the moment, I might add, but you know, if you've done dairy, it's tough.
Yeah.
You're not interested in 4 a.m. starts, Paul?
Look, the one thing about the dairy board is you can never complain about early starts, because, you know, by the time I start a meeting with these guys, they're on smoko. You know, it's 8 a.m. in the morning and they're having their first smokos, and that's when I start. So you can't whinge about early starts on the dairy board.
Yeah, that's really interesting to hear about how we're transitioning away. Is it really just is it purely just led by better price to have a beef farm as opposed to staying with dairy, or is there a bit
Look,
of a tailwind from the previous dairy versus Coles Woolly situation?
look, all animal products have cyclic nature. You know, if you're in agriculture, I'll give you a really good figure. People talk about 10 seasons in agriculture. You make money in 3, you lose money in 3, and you break even in 4. Doesn't matter whether you're cropping, with your beef, with your dairy. That's pretty much it. And they might be, they generally come in blocks. But anyone who's beef farming knows, you know, the price will come off. Dairy, you know, at the moment, we're getting the best prices for dairy, you know, for milk we've ever got. We're up to about close to $10 a kilogram of solids. It's phenomenal. But cost of goods have gone up. You know, fuel's gone up. You know, the dairies are susceptible to the same thing. You know, we are. The cost of goods have gone up. Fertilizer prices have gone up, but generally the margins are better now. Look, a bit of it, it's you know, farming cattle and sheep is a lot easier job than doing dairy. The other thing is
a supply chain thing, or just making sure, you know,
dairies are, you know, it's 365 days a year. It's 7 days a week. I mean, you don't get up on a Saturday and think, oh, I'm buggered, I don't want to go and milk those cows. And generally, most of our dairies milk twice a day. Some actually quite interesting are milking 3 times a day now. So there's some changes in the systems. Some have gone to 1 day, 1 milking a day. It's so there's, as I said, you just got to be careful when people tell you about figures, where they draw their figures from. You know, and a lot of the discussion I have on LinkedIn, if you hook up with me on LinkedIn, you'll see I have some of the discussions. A lot of it's just people not actually realizing the data doesn't not necessarily say what they want it to say.
Yeah, 100%. And I think one of the reasons for getting the both of you here today is, for me, sometimes when I read these articles, and I guess generally with ag it's the same as well, but none of them as much as I mentioned earlier, like an emotional hostage, while like a situation when I'm reading it, I just feel like, oh, big words, big numbers, really scary. We are suffocating our planets, we're killing it off. And even from reputable sources as well, it's just sort of like, okay, am I and am I a bad person for continuing, so for not transitioning to Oatly, for example? But
let's deal with something. So we do, whatever you're doing has to be more sustainable. There's no one farming, no one doing food production that's not looking at being more sustainable. So if you're a manufacturer, you're focusing on your energy costs and doing whatever you can. So if you look at dairy manufacturing, most of the manufacturers have pulled their energy costs back by half by looking at smarter alternative energy sources, recycling of water. You know, so there's a lot of things a manufacturer can do to improve their sustainability. And the same on farm. I think the thing, I picked on one thing that gets lost in this argument, is nutrition. And I keep pushing now that in the long run, we're going to talk about all food as a nutritional unit to an environmental footprint. That nutritional unit is not going to be a single component. It's not going to be just iron or protein. It's going to be the whole package. And that environmental footprint is not just going to be greenhouse gas. It's going to be land utilization, water utilization, biodiversity. We've actually seen some of those schemes. There's a really nice scheme up in Queensland, which pays you, they use it as like a carbon credit but you get credits for biodiversity. You get credits for employing Indigenous staff. So they've just built an algorithm. All we're talking about is algorithms. You know, you build a whole lot of data on one side of the equation, a whole lot of data. Now, some people are actually doing some work in this area. And when you do that, it changes it. So when you look at these things about, let's pick on greenhouse, because greenhouse isn't a really important one. livestock are one of the major, methane producers. Not chickens and not pigs. So again, that's why it's important to look at species. But the quality of their protein is generally 2 or 3 times. So when you put that on one side and you do the calculations, these figures come back to very different outcomes. So that's one thing we've got to remember, is the reason we have food is primarily nutrition.
Yeah.
We could all drink water and we would be very sustainable, but we just wouldn't live very long.
Yeah, wouldn't be very healthy.
Apparently, there's a call.
I wonder if I jump in as well, if you don't mind, Paul. I think
please.
You've made some real pertinent points, and I'd say that for the really, I'd be interested. I wish we were all in the same room, because I'd be really interested to get the cohort sort of take on some of these conversations. But this is the complexity that we're navigating, right? A global food system which is complex, with nutritional needs which are different by system. I guess one thing I'd love to just completely agree with Paul is, humans do make really silly choices. Okay, we are selfishly driven, and also we are very much at the behest of marketing and advertising when it comes to food production and consumption as well. So I completely agree with you on that point in particular, that there is a real need for us to consider the nutritional requirements, and in developed nations, ultimately it's a reduction in calories and probably improving in the quality. Like, where are you deriving your calories from? Is it cane sugar, or is it whole foods based? Are you getting enough protein, etc.? Whereas you've got conditions in developing countries where a lot of people are malnourished, and that's a different problem to solve for. Both problems to solve for, though, I guess in those markets. And the other point that you made, which is around, I don't know if it was intrinsically this point, but what I took from it is the fact that production practices globally, with any grower, any primary producer in the livestock or meat production or dairy production industries, their priority is absolutely efficiency, which is efficiency of resources, which means energy, land use, conversion of calories and inputs into outputs. So definitely, in Australia at least, we have some of the most when it comes to our beef and lamb, it's very special. It's mostly produced using extensive grazing, and it's amongst the most sustainable production practices on the planet. We've got some really incredible growers, and globally there are some incredible growers as well. So there's from my perspective, there's absolutely no arguments there. The point being, though, that this cellular agriculture isn't necessarily to be seen as something to come in and replace the need for those industries. It's to complement and provide an alternative that's different, and that can theoretically, the promise of cellular agriculture, again, to be investigated, as with all good innovations, but in theory, a pro of cultured meat is that you could have these facilities located anywhere, whether that be a city or a rural area. Obviously, in order for them to be more sustainable, they would need to be powered by renewable energy. So that's something to call out, and it's an important factor in the design and implementation of these kinds of any manufacturing facility, really. But especially that promise of the environmental benefits is purely due to the fact that it's an electrified system that can be based off renewable power and energy. So that's why, and we can probably dive into markets a bit further, but that's why countries like, for example, Singapore, where they're land constrained, is really pro-cultured meat. And for that market, it's a great solution, because for them, being able to produce and have food security within their country, their goal being 30% of food production, of national food production by 2030 within their own country. In order to achieve that, innovation and technology is required. So I guess the way, and again, I've been working in cellular agriculture now for under a year, and really learning a huge amount about it. But the promise of it is that it's a solution for certain types of markets at certain types of its evolution. Because when you first start, I think you made this point earlier, Paul, but correct me if I'm wrong, is that the unit economics need to add up as well. So when you first start, when you're at a pilot or even larger scale manufacturing that's primarily based on the pharmaceutical industry technology and needs to continue to iterate, the unit cost is relatively high. So no, cellular agriculture at that point of its evolution and innovation is not a solution for sub-Saharan Africa. But as the unit economics decrease over time, as innovation and efficiencies get driven by continued innovation and scale, then absolutely the promise is that it could one day be a solution for certain communities or certain areas where either land, water is constrained, or there's large populations in a really concentrated area with really high demand and need for certain nutrition, for example. So they're the kinds of opportunities, pros and cons and market constraints that we think about when we talk about market fit for cultured meat as well. So I know I kind of went around in a big loop, but I hope that iterate sort of complements what Paul's saying in that it is complex. Food systems aren't linear and they're not the same globally. So you have to consider that when you're looking at your strategy for alternatives.
Yeah, that's great. And you've also just gone and blitzed through 3 questions as well, so it's great. I will love to.
I can dive into all of them a bit more.
We'll love to.
We'll
love to. And we're having questions coming up in the chat box as well on this. So I'm just going to pose a question, and then back to our convo. I feel like Paul is keen to dive a little bit deeper. But so from what we have discussed thus far, I can see that there's 2 main things. Like when we are discussing this whole nutrition and feeding people efficiently. So there's definitely the nutrition side of things. Is the science currently ready to deal with food security issues? Is the protein profile enough to help with the needs? I know once upon a time there was a startup that came out, Soylent, who wanted to deal with this, but apparently it was just because the tech bro founder didn't want to spend time thinking about what he wants to eat. The whole feeding developing nations or the entire planet was actually a secondary thoughts or good to have. So to your point, Georgia, on earlier, how a lot of our current food market is heavily driven by marketing. And so I guess there's a little bit of a misinformation navigation that we could dig deeper. Goodness. So there's a nutrition, but also the accessibility as well, as Paul has mentioned as well. So like, would it be easy for regions to access it? Do they even have the energy to be able to have these sort of labs? How are you going to ensure? Because I remember having a conversation with Adrian from Myanmar, and for them it's just so much easier to just go straight to meats. There is not even a single consideration. Yes, on the extreme side of political and like turmoil kind of environment, so you can't really establish anything to extent. And do agree to say countries like Singapore, perhaps to extent to Taiwan or other small kind of like island countries as well. And they also rely quite a bit on import, but they also have the money to support that too. So would love for us to just sort of like unpack on these, and perhaps we could just start from the protein profile. Can science actually support, like what about the amino acid that Paul talked about, the very key ingredients that's required for a human body? Would you like to go first, Paul?
Yeah, lots of different things there. I actually met the Soylent guy in Milan.
No way.
In 2016.
Spill the tea. What are they like?
Well, it's green. I mean, it's not the most appetizing. This very green product, and their commercial they ran was exactly that. It's the tech geek who hasn't got time to leave their desk to go and get a meal, so he just drinks his meal on the go. And it was male because the tech geeks were traditionally male. It's the weirdest product I've seen.
Again, I would argue, where were the consumer insights that drove that strategy?
Well, no, right? I would also argue, where is the naming from? Has no one seen Soylent Green before? It's horrible.
Look, let's just, there's a lot of things. Let's just take that high one. And I think a really good thing, that was raised. Michelle Colgrove, who, if you don't know, leads up the CSIRO's protein mission, really, really good scientist. She uses the term complementary, and I think it's a better, because alternatives suggest we need this one and not that one, and what we actually need is complementary. So it's and I think most of us are actually talking about complementary products. Let's just have a look at what's happened. So cell-based and precision fermentation are relatively new people on the block. but the plant-based have been around for a while. And let's talk about what's actually happened in that. So the growth in those markets was big, but last year in the US, it really capped out and it sort of flattened. And people are now getting, oh, what's going on there? And there's a lot of speculation about that. So you've got companies like Beyond and Oatly, collectively they lost $20 billion in market value. Venture capital people look at that and go, oh, what's going on there? But part of what fundamentally people got wrong was the fact that taste and texture is something consumers won't give up. So taste and texture is really important. A lot of products come in the market. There's something like 1,300 alternative protein, I use the term because that's what they call them, companies in the world. Most of those in the plant-based space. So there's lots of products. You go to the supermarket here, there's hundreds of products, but generally they haven't met consumer expectations. Initially, the VC spin was, well, we've got vegans, that's 6%. We've got vegetarians, that's another 10%. And then we've got flexitarians, which is 40%. And look, we've got over half the market. Now, didn't work out that way because the flexitarians don't really exist. Flexitarians are people who try different things, but they don't necessarily stick. So I use the term, they flex in, they flex out, they don't hang around. So you haven't got over 50% of the market. So the addressable market, nice term that you'll find in your business, people talk about what is the addressable market, is a lot less than people were predicting. And hence you've got companies like JBS recently just shut down its plant-based factory in the States, and a couple $100 million, and they just shut it down. Morningstar has done the same. So there's a bit of a rationalization going up, and it's a bit of a warning for people who are coming along with new products that in the end, taste and texture is fundamental to selling in a marketplace, particularly if you're talking about food.
Yeah, absolutely.
We've also got the mycelium products. So they've been around, Quorum's 1985, I think that started. So, this is the sort of idea of growing fungi and whole cuts. So this is what people call as biomass fermentation, relatively simple fermentation. So that's there as well, and a lot more products coming in that space, but haven't quite matched. I mean, the thing about mushrooms, as you know, is they've got a really strong taste. And some people love it, and some people go, oh, bugger, you put mushrooms in that dish. So that's one of the problems that they're going to have to deal with is that taste and texture issues. So I think that's one really important thing, is just think about it. And look, to be honest, we're talking about developed nations here. We just, because that's where these products sit at the moment. So taste and texture is big learning. Price, another thing. If you look around, most of these sort of plant-based are a higher price than the cheaper cuts of meat, not the most expensive, but the cheaper cuts, whether it's chicken, pork, or lamb. So they haven't met the price. You got people like Pat Brown from Impossible just saying, well, we'll meet price and then it'll all be all over. I think Pat's being a bit over optimistic. And if you see recently, they've just cut 6% of their workforce. So obviously,
is Impossible the one at Hungry Jack's, the Rebel Whopper? And I think V2 is with grilled, isn't it? Or
V2 is V2. So you've got Beyond and Impossible going head to head in the States. Right. V2 is the Australian company, which is sort of growing, but still largely Australian.
I remember one is with one of the SproutX S22 did a tasting session around, and it was.
They go with different chains. The big thing about Impossible, it's the one that's got the recombinant heme in it that gives it the sort of smell and taste of meat when you cook it. That's essentially what Impossible's big secret is, recombinant heme, which gets us into the whole precision fermentation space.
But that's the three, isn't it, Paul? I mean, when we talk about categories or clusters that we're talking about here, just for everyone, the cohort's benefit, really, we're talking about, and if we were to go really high level, we're talking about three different categories. We've got plant-based, purely plant-based, which, to Paul's point, is trying to replace, looking at a direct replacement. So plant ingredients combined together in some form of food processing techniques to mimic animal protein. Then you've got the use of some form of precision fermentation. So Impossible is a really great example of that, where they use precision fermentation for their heme ingredient, which they then combine with plant-based ingredients. So it's sort of a bit of a combination of those two sort of types, I guess, of alternatives. And then you have purely cultured meat, which is more, I guess, the body of work that Val is focused on. Yeah.
And I've got lost where I was going with all of that because there's so many different topics to touch on. What was it? You asked me a specific question. I've lost it.
Yeah, no, but also good point, Georgia, for sort of like sharing through with the cohort on the categories as well. Been chatting with a few cohort members, and they're quite shocked to hear that some of the meats, the alt proteins that says, you know, like we don't need that much animals, still requires animals to extract cells from. So they're not exactly completely animal free. So to go into these sort of like categories, great. Paul, to your question, we've talked a little bit about how where science is right now to support the nutrition, but what about access? Specifically, we'll love to talk about things like, you know, can a lab even support mass consumption? Can they even be in a position to feed that many mouths? What about things like energy, water use, all the natural resources required? Seeing that we are comparing, you know, what livestock industry is doing to the environment, but also with livestock.
Okay, back on the topic. So let's get into cell-based and precision. So I'll give you my bottom line in the end, having been around, you know, this sort of tech, fermenters and that, is that it's expensive tech. So the first thing I say is to use an expensive technology to compete in a commodity market is a business 101 failure. So, and I might add, Val, that isn't their business model. So Georgie will tell you about that. But for those people who are saying, I'm going to go out there and I'm going to get my product down to $2 a kilogram, which is sort of chicken mince or you know, they don't call it mince in the States, forget the name, chuck steak or something. That's crazy, because this is expensive tech. You know, I mean, these fermenters, they're state of the art. Stainless steel, all sorts of probes and gadgets. They're not your $20 an hour people who run these things. You know, it's a sophisticated tech. The media you use, if you want to get rid of serum, which we did in the 90s for a lot of pharmaceutical manufacture, then you need expensive growth hormones, etc. So it's expensive tech. So that's the first point I make. So I don't believe it's actually ever going to compete with commodity products, you know. And that's why, again, Val's model is different, because, you know, I remember the first conversation with George, he said, look, he got that. The other thing about it is scale. I mean, if you can't scale, you're not an alternative, you're not a complementary. And you know, when you look at it, if you look at all the work that's gone into the plant-based space, they occupy 1.4% of the meat market in the US. We use the US because we've got better data, also a big market, but 1.4% after decades. So the other thing I worry about is on the cell base is the ability to scale. So when we talk about scale, we're talking about going from 2,000 litres to 10 or 20,000 litres. If you look at just in the States, they've commissioned some 250,000 litre vessels. Okay, 250,000 litre vessels. No one's ever been near that to scale this technology. That's reckless. That's a reckless statement, you know. Yet they've, you know, they're out and they've announced it. So some of these people are forgetting some basics of biology. My favorite one is people like to tell me about Moore's law and that price of everything gets reduced. And my answer is Moore's law has never been applied to biology. It's an engineering concept, and it doesn't apply to biology because biology has feedback. Cells won't grow in water. They won't grow up at certain densities. They need certain nutrients. So they're fussy, you know. So that's some of the things, and, you know, I've written papers you can read in the detail that I just don't think scalability is an issue. And I think cost is an issue. There's a whole lot of other things about whether you can match taste, because you're just growing cells. Most of the taste is in fat, and you've got to add minerals back. So, so you've got to reconstruct your product. But to me, in the end, it's the inability to scale and its cost, which means these will be high-priced products for niche markets. Now, Georgie, I'll throw it back to you, because you can tell what the VAL model is.
Yeah. Well, I think, Paul's made some really good points, which, if you want to, and this is, I suppose, for the benefit of this cohort, we've got potential founders in the room here. When you're thinking about your strategies, if any of you are really interested in coming up with a product or a technology which helps to address some of these, the protein needs of growing populations, whether across many categories, then the things you really need to be considering are exactly the sorts of points that Paul was making. And I guess I would just emphasize VAL's approach, which is, if we look at, if I can answer the question, I suppose, in this way, is how do you actually transition from, lab to mass consumption of an alternative, which is complementary, as we've discussed, to livestock production in the dairy industry globally. So how do you actually enter that market? I think there's two ways of probably breaking that down. One is the consumer and the brand. How do you actually scale from that aspect? And the other is technologically, how do you scale? So physically harvesting and producing product. So VAL's approach really is, you got to create something better than the alternative that consumers will choose selfishly. We've always got to be learning really quickly and iterating often in response to consumer insights. So market fit is really key. And that's why, and we're quite open about our strategy here. That's why our initial strategy, because we know that our unit economics is going to be high, and our first product is really to look for markets where that makes sense and where you can leverage exclusivity for a higher price point to enter a market, which is a really good example of this is, say, the sashimi, originally illegal in the US prior to the 1980s, changed the legislation. It then entered really high-end dining, and it slowly trickled down into the various other categories, whether it be something that the health conscious would pay a premium for sometimes, then over time, it's now everywhere, as an example. Now, I'm not saying that that's necessarily, a direct translation is what will happen in cellular agriculture, but it is a good precedent for us to work off, which is to say that if we can really generate popular demand by driving at categories where you are, to Paul's point, revenue positive, because the unit economics and the commercial aspect have to add up. So when you're looking at, say, some of the alternatives and our peers in the plant-based space, where unfortunately we are seeing some transition away from some of their commitments, for example, and inability to really achieve unit economics, they're not profitable, basically, to a point. It's how can you evolve your customer and brand strategy in line with your unit economics and your technological innovation, so that where you're at that point in time. So that's why our strategy is very much focused on that high-end dining to start with. And our view is that we would then, from a technological perspective, our goal is to stabilize our process and then to continue to optimize for efficiency over time and continue to scale rapidly, continuing always to look at reducing unit economics so that we can enter new markets, because you can't enter a market that you can't afford to be in, for want of a better term. If your cost of production is significantly higher than what that market will pay for that product, then you're setting yourself up to fail. So it's important to have a strategy which sort of matches the commercial reality of where your innovation is at a point in time. I think that, as to your point, Paul, at this point in time, the majority of the technology which we're using in cellular agriculture does come from the pharmaceutical industry, which is super expensive and requires a really high degrees of sterility and control. I think the opportunity is to continue to invest and innovate and learn from other industries, such as brewing or other related industries and technologies where we can look to reduce costs. So continuing again to drive down that unit economics. So there is a bit of a reliance, I guess, within cellular agriculture and an appreciation that this is going to be a collective success. If it's it will be a collective success of adjacent industries such as media companies, bioreactor technology, etc., to really work together collaboratively, which is what I guess BAO is driving as well, is ensuring that we continue to obviously optimize our process, but optimize the inputs that we're getting into our business that are critical to produce our product. So media is a really good example of that. At the moment, the cost of media is quite high, but with really good partnerships and really good collaborations, like you would have seen with other tech companies coming together and collaborating, it is possible, theoretically, for us to really drive down the cost of production over time. But that's, I guess, a bit of the honest realities. But for the benefit of this cohort, like we are absolutely, you know, as all startups, we are really driving towards that outcome, and we've got laser focus on our targets of what we're trying to achieve, and we'll continue to innovate and iterate. But it's just, you know, for the benefit of this group, when you're thinking about some of like validating some of the business ideas, for example, or innovative solutions that you're coming up with, is really just to consider the commercial, the technology, and the consumer. You can't forget the consumer. Is probably the pertinent point here.
Yeah, you've touched on a few good points there, and I'm just also now calling some of the questions from chats. I feel like we've sort of answered a bit on the major challenges on breaking into other ag markets, specifically for developing countries. But Scott, if I may reframe your question a little bit, for both, I guess, Georgia and Paul. Two questions on top of my, how old even is this technology of cellular ag? And also, have you guys seen that it has collectively, I guess globally, doesn't matter which country, has already reached a point where they're in a position to be able to even get into developing countries or feeding population, or is it currently still just a supplementary early stage kind of scene?
Look, I think if you look at all of these complementary areas, they aren't doing anything in these countries. You know, it doesn't matter whether it's plant-based. I mean, the reality, if you look at the global diet's about 70% plant, 30% animal-based. If you look at Africa, it's even more skewed than that. Unfortunately, what generally happens is that a lot of the plant-based materials they eat are poor nutritional. They're tubers and things like that. You know, there's not a lot of fresh fruit. There's not a lot of nuts. They're expensive. So it's sort of one of the reasons why a lot of us were pretty angry with the Eat Lancet diet. You've probably heard about this sort of global diet. I mean, most of Africa and India was excluded because they don't actually have access to those sort of products. They're saying eat more natural products, eat more natural fruits, and that they just don't have the access or the affordability. So I honestly think at the moment, you know, you can really take the developing nations out of the equation before, you know, this tech's got to be proven out in developing nations, and then we might be able to look across. And if you think about Australia, you know, we produce enough food to feed about 60 million people. So, you know, so that's the first thing. When, you know, when COVID hit and people were panicking, you know, food off the shelf, guys, you're not going to starve in Australia. We're a very good and a very high quality, efficient food producing country from you know, major exporter of grains, of meat, of dairy. But we're high end. I mean, our costs, you know, we're not going to go out and compete in Asia. We're going to sell in the top end restaurants. I mean, I worked for a while as a consultant for a company called AACO, the biggest cattle operation. I mean, their premium steak is $200 a steak. And all of it's pre-sold before that animal even's born. I mean, their system is quite, and that's the ideal. You know, what if you think about farming, everyone wants to pre-sell, and that's why branded products is the biggest growing area in food, because people want the higher value, and that's probably where we're driving in Australia. How do we extract a higher value? That's one of the arguments. If you look at V2, for instance, you know, they're arguing that let's be in the plant-based area, but let's get a better value for the products we produce. Now, the problem, they've chosen pea protein as their base, and we don't grow a lot of pea protein in Australia, so they actually have to import their pea protein. But yeah, I mean, if you just talk about Australia, we're good at producing food, we're good at high quality, but we're not good at the commodity markets. You know, we're not going to go out there and compete in the lower end markets. And the other thing, when we look at some of these technologies, it's not a prime steak. I went to the markets yesterday and I paid, I think $60 a kilo for some nice tuna. I paid $50 a kilo for a nice Angus steak and about $30 a kilo for some nice lamb chops.
Yeah.
I'm not paying that for a burger. I'm not paying that for sausages. So that's the other thing to remember, that when we're talking about this technology, it's actually not steak. There are companies looking at three-dimensional, but that's just adding costs. There's people looking at 3D printing and things like that, but that's just adding cost. So it's not the high end of the market.
No, but I also think I'd like to not necessarily challenge, but just counter the question. Is the question, one question to ask is, you know, what will cellular agriculture do for developing nations? That's one question, but it's also which are the countries of which it is most applicable, you know, and which are the countries of which the opportunity is the greatest. And I'd say, you know, you're seeing that cluster around really the small sort of resource-strapped countries, the UAE, Singapore, for example, where they can't produce much domestically and are really open to these innovations and technologies, and you know, mainly from a country-wide food security perspective, and they're really, for want of a better term, not throwing money, but they're making funding, making funding opportunities very available to build factories, you know, in their countries, and trying to get companies to file for approval, for example, which is why VAO's first target market is Singapore. Then you've got the bigger fish, the bigger categories of the US, the UK, the EU. Now these are huge markets. No, this is not the vast percentage of the growing population, which we know is in developing countries. But I would then counter that with, well, what does Australian primary production currently do for developing nations at this point? The food systems are complex, the nutritional needs are complex, and therefore no one solution around protein is going to answer the question for a developing nation versus a large market like the US versus a small land constrained island like Singapore. So I think we have to be very cognizant that we don't just, like to your point earlier, first of all, we don't batch all of the data in a global context, and then we also don't batch all the solutions in a global context. They are wide and varied and nuanced depending on the needs of the consumers in those markets. Would just be what I'd preface there. And I just thought I'd add to that because it's a question we get asked quite a lot around, like, what will cellular agriculture do for developing nations? I think, you know, giving the innovation time, if we can get the unit economics right and we can get the technology to a certain stage, then I'd like to think that we could make it work for that consumer. We're a while off that though. We're quite a while off that. And in order to get there, we have to solve problems for consumers that do make sense in order to continue to feed funding into the innovation so that we can continue to optimize it, if that makes sense. So yes, start with the end in mind, but we also have to be commercially viable and address the needs of consumers today so that we can keep iterating. So I'd encourage all of you as, you know, future founders to really think about your strategy when you're looking at solutions in this space, to make sure that you can be in it for the long haul to get to that end outcome, if that is your pursuit. You know, if your pursuit is to come up with a solution for developing nations, you have to be able to get the solution to that level of innovation to address that problem, if that makes sense. I don't know, I might have bastardized that a little bit, Paul, but happy to be corrected.
You're right. We don't export a lot. You know, countries like India, we can't because they won't let our products in. Remember, that's the other thing. I mean, tariffs are still healthy. You know, China is still a big market, but obviously they've penalised some of our products. Wine, I know a lot of good wine at the moment because it's not going to China. I can tell you that.
Huh.
Yeah.
I remember when lobsters were cheap. Life was
Yeah.
good.
Yeah,
But
unintended consequences of the shift in global demand for food products, right? It's complex.
Yeah, I think we're venturing into a very good point here, which I like to dabble a little bit on policy as well. So I guess this is policy, but also regulations too, right? So talking about commercializing, but also I suppose as a startup, getting the runway to be able to solve and test out all of these hypotheses, Georgia. In terms of like say funding opportunity for alt protein space, like what are you both currently seeing the governments and VC react to this new technology? Is there even like, is it currently still just hype? Is it that like people are still being sold on a dream to say like, oh, I'm going to jump in on Oatly and all these kind of like alt protein ideas? And also government wise, is there crickets on their ends at the moment, or are they actively funding as well?
Okay, great question. I'll do my best to answer this. I've kind of touched on it a little bit, so I'll try not to sort of double up here. But I think let's say we start with talking about governments. Again, it's two clusters predominantly that we're seeing that we want to engage with. One being the small resource constrained countries. They are very proactive and very active in our dialogue back and forth with cellular agriculture companies. Now, again, I'm talking from the perspective of if we go back to our original premise that within this space, we're looking at sort of three categories: precision fermentation, plant-based, cellular agriculture. I'm only talking about cellular agriculture from our perspective. So definitely a lot of interest, and definitely the availability of capital and or resources to manufacture in those countries. The bigger fish like the US and the EU, I'll break them down a little bit. The US, there's lots of interest, there's lots of capital, but it's a really challenging political environment. So it's absolutely a market that we would want to enter, but we would have to enter it at the right time from a regulatory perspective, which ultimately for everyone here, what that means is you need a really stable, consistent, reliable process in order to get really good data behind any kind of submission to, say, the FDA in the US. So that's not necessarily a constraint, but that's something that we are actively working towards. It's a long-term investment of political will, though. You know, regulatory dialogue with the FDA is a long-term game. The EU, look, you usually have to demonstrate that you've sold elsewhere for at least 3 years before the EU will entertain letting you have something novel in their market. So again, that's a longer-term strategy. The UK, bit of a dark horse, I guess you could say, post-Brexit, because there's no longer that interaction as, you know, the EU's premise of that they want to see it tried and tested elsewhere. The UK are open to the idea, but that's as much as they've sort of shared at this point. China, to your point, Paul, dark horse as well, very much can change overnight. So I guess our strategy at this point is really to focus on those, go with the path of least resistance and work with the willing. And in the markets where the unit economics make sense and you can actually, we can deliver something for consumers in those markets. From a VC funding perspective, a really strong momentum here for cellular agriculture. Obviously, the global financial situation at the moment, we have seen markets overall dip early this year, but climate tech investments are still very much continuing. The only thing I would sort of call out here regarding VCs is that, or venture capital investment, is often because cellular agriculture is quite novel and niche at this point in time. A lot of VCs will choose one, like pick one horse. So they'll support and place their bet in an industry or in a subset of alternative protein and potentially hedge their bets there and watch that space evolve. So it's about working with the willing, but also working with venture capital firms that believe in your particular strategy, which is the same, and that would be the case for all of you founders working with venture capital. It would be the same across. It's picking the venture capital companies and the firms that align with your strategy and see the value in what you're trying to do. Just be mindful that if you're playing in alternative protein spaces, if you can see from their portfolios that they already have significant investments in this space, it could be that they've hedged their bets there, and that, you know, that might be why the funding might be limited from that particular pool of funds. So make sure you really broaden, I guess, your exposure to different types of venture capital firms as well, would be a suggestion.
Yeah, and also sounds like it's also a space where capital could be high as well, with all the capex costs too, and hardware to I guess the environment, the labs to support. Would you say, if any future funds were to start?
I guess you again, you have to have a really sound strategy for how you intend to scale. So I guess they will ultimately be investing in your projected revenue and impact. So you need to be able to demonstrate that you've got the capability, so the talent pool within your own team, to deliver on the strategy which you're essentially asking them to invest in. So when it comes to how you actually scale from R&D to pilot to then full commercial scale, one, you need to have a really sound strategy, and you have to have the right people in place to demonstrate you have the capability to achieve the strategy. Would be my first piece. If you can demonstrate that, what we've found is that you get really strong momentum and engagement from venture capital.
Yeah, that's right. Do you have a question here? And perhaps I will pose this off to Paul. This is from Rob. He's asking, as the developing world starts to consume more animal-based protein, do we anticipate that to come from locally produced sources, or more likely to import meat from nations like Australia or Brazil?
Unfortunately, then they generally don't have the foreign capital. So, the reason why, GovMed exists is to try to help them be more sustainable. So if I'll give you an example. If you're looking at a dairy cow in India, then it's probably producing about 2 to 4 litres of milk a day. Here, that would be 20 to 30 litres. So if we can help them by putting better genetics in, by better breeding systems, healthier animals, vaccines, etc., then we might be able to get them up to 10 litres per day. So that's really the driver there, is to actually help them. If you look at Africa, the majority of food is actually from smallholder farmers. These people who earn less than $2 US a day. So the whole idea is to build them up so that they're more productive, their animals are healthier. It's also better sustainability, because the problem about a cow that produces 2 to 4 litres, it probably still has the same greenhouse gas emissions. So if you can improve the productivity, you can halve their greenhouse gas emissions. So that's the other reason why we want to help in those countries, is that we can have a really positive environmental impact by improving the productivity of their animals. So I think, I was in Africa in March, and they were already aware of famine hitting there, because they are so susceptible to global trends. We talk about global issues, but the most susceptible people always get hit first. So fertilizer price, fuel costs were already hitting there, such that a backyard farmer who's growing chickens, so this is basically what happens there, is they've got another job. They might be a real estate agent. This is I went and visited this, but at home, on the second floor of her home, she's got a few sheep and chickens. She buys 1-day-old chickens and she grows them out. Now, the cost of growing out those chickens doubled. So she just stopped doing it. So you've got all these people who just stopped producing protein. So famine was already hitting in March, when no one here was talking about that, because their production is shutting down, because a lot of it is really opportunistic production. Africa, India, they're really tough gigs. So I think it will need to be local production. And we need to do that because we need to actually have them more sustainable. If you look at a global map of greenhouse gas emissions, then you'll find it's really hot in the US and Europe, the big energy countries. But if you look at it on food, it's actually hot in Africa and India, because their unit production of meat, grain, whatever it is, it's low. So that's another reason because we won't solve global the global energy crisis or the global, greenhouse gas by just fixing it in our own countries. We've got to help Africa and India fix it as well.
100%, 100%. Ash, you've got a question?
Yeah, my one's for Georgia. In terms of cellular agriculture, and it being a complementary option, is the nutrition profile the same as meat in the industry now, like right now, or is there still quite a long way to go? And how much cellular agricultural meat is available for consumers now, and how is it marketed differently to, say, plant-based food? Like, how do you make the consumer understand those differences just by looking at the packet?
Yeah, great questions. I'll ask them in the inverse because I'll remember them hopefully better, but remind me if I forget them. So the first question, the last question you posed there was, how do you position this with consumers? Our positioning and our belief is really that we're saying we're growing meat without the animal, ultimately. Now, I want to highlight that I don't want to greenwash you all. Of course, the original cell bank for growing up the cells in a bioreactor would have come from a biopsy from an animal, okay? But that's one biopsy that can then be turned into a cell bank, which can then be immortalized and replicated infinitely, okay? So we're talking an original one biopsy to, mass scale production is the theory, right? And our positioning to that would be, and how do you get consumers excited about that? Well, that's really the next frontier for us. We're really excited to launch our first product in Singapore and to learn from that experience and really gain consumer insights, because you do not gain consumer insights from iterating on a whiteboard. You have to get a product in front of them and really learn about what works, what doesn't. To Paul's point, we know that texture is key. So we're spending a lot of time on texture and flavor profile is key too. Nutritional, to answer your other question around the nutritional aspects of say our first product, well, what we're looking at is a product which is derived from 100% quail cells, which is a pure protein. Now, I'm not going to pretend like I'm an expert on the exact nutrient profile of our product, because that's very much our food inventors and our manufacturing team's expertise. So I'll do my best to keep to what I know, so that I'm sharing what I know. And if you would like, I can always dig a bit deeper in this. But my understanding is that as we continue to, what the R&D team is predominantly focused on, amongst other things, there's work being done to look at what is the optimum media component, so the nutrient source that helps to grow up the cell bank. What's the ultimate composition of that media formulation to get the best possible nutrient outcome? For our first product, what we're trying to do is launch a product so that we can get some consumer insights and feedback from the market, and we can be revenue positive and start to really drive that flywheel. But what our product team is looking to iterate on for our second product is how can we really optimize for nutrition, and what would the market be for that? So a great example would be a product that has got significantly higher bioavailable elements of iron for health and well-being for women, for example. That's just an example. But how can you ultimately grow up a cell or a combination of different cells to get the best possible iron profile and amino acid profile, for example? So that's a long way to answer the question. The short way would be to say, how does it compare, your question, how does it compare currently to, say, a premium steak when it comes to the amino acid profile, the iron, all the B vitamins, all the other things that are in there, which Paul can talk to much better than me. I would say we're a way off from that. But the R&D rigor is being put in that place at the moment. We're really focusing in on that and how we can optimize for that. Again, though, driven by market need, purely because we need to make sure that the products that we put onto the market have a viable market, so that we can keep funneling that flywheel and innovating over time. So I hope that answered that's a really purely honest answer to your question. And I'm happy to take follow-up questions on that. I think it's really promising. The team that are working, I know for a fact that the team internally at Val that are focusing on nutrient profile and second product are doing some really exciting experiments and researching this, but it is at R&D stage, to be clear. It's not yet at manufacturing scale.
Okay. Yeah,
Yeah.
thank you.
I was just about to ask as well on the stage, because there's a few protein peeps I know. It's like a huge deal even just to get one sample out to one or two agri-corporate businesses as well, and can appreciate the a lot of time in even just texture. Apparently it's all about binding of the ingredient and oil. That's really just it. Apparently, is what I've heard.
And some other, yes, food
and a lot of
processing
other
techniques.
processing techniques.
Yeah. There's,
Yeah.
I would think it's probably suffice it to say, any food processing technique and innovation that can inform and influence texture is something that we are actively investigating. Because to your point, Paul, and to Val's strategy, consumers will not choose an alternative or something that's complementary unless it meets their expectations, and they have very high expectations on flavor and texture. And if you don't solve for those, then ultimately your product is not going to meet the expectations of consumers. So it's really key. And that's why we have such an amazing team of food innovators, because it's all, we've got, as you can imagine, a really strong emphasis on the R&D, a really strong emphasis on stabilizing our manufacturing process. But as soon as you've harvested that product, you're only halfway there. You've got to then come up with a product that you can serve to a consumer, which will blow their minds.
Yeah, sounds like a very long journey, not for the faint heart, but also extremely rewarding as well. I've got a question from Marion here. I suppose this is for Paul, but Georgia, if you see anything, feel free to jump in. So this is from observation that you're on the advisory group for CSIRO Future Protein Mission. What do you think are the most promising or exciting opportunities in the alt protein space at the moment?
So obviously V2 looks like it's been a success. They're growing, they're building factories, they're exporting, I think, to 7 countries now. They actually have met price parity, and I went into the supermarket and checked that, because they'd probably be one of the few. But yes, I can go in, I can buy V2 products at price parity. So that obviously looks interesting. There's no reason why Australia shouldn't be a player in this space, and if we can use the science out of CSO to get that taste, texture, etc. right. I haven't tried the product, so I can't really comment on tasting. Yeah, I've tried some of the products in the US, like the Impossible. That, and it really depends on how you cook it. The one I had with Impossible, I just cooked it, was like a burnt bit of toast. It wasn't particularly flavoursome. A lot of people are using chicken because what's chicken taste like? It would taste whatever sauce you put with it. Really, that's the beauty of chicken. It doesn't really have a great flavor necessarily. So some of the things that they're doing. So yes, building on the V2 story is one thing. They're looking at a new white fish species for up in the north, so for aquaculture. So you're aware of our success down in Tasmania with salmon. That industry is worth about 600, 700 million, aim to grow to $1 billion. I did some work for them on some vaccine work. But they're looking at the other piece of the market is the white fish market. We're a major importer of white fish. So they're looking at and I forget the species, they did tell me, but it wasn't one I'm familiar with. And all the issues around how you grow that, how you cultivate that fish species. Sara's been into prawns for a while as well, and feed for those. So that's the other thing about a lot of these animal species is we're an importer sometimes of the feed. So we import, a lot of the food for salmon is actually imported. So can we actually produce our own feed? And that's where, with my insect protein hat on, we make insect protein products for dogs and cats. But in the long run, when you get to scale, then feeding fish, building our aquaculture industry, chickens, chicken fanciers buy the actual larvae off us because their chickens like to eat insects, so give them the actual whole larva. Pretty small market, the chicks and fanciers. But so there's markets there. They're looking at the precision fermentation space. But again, what we lack in Australia is a large-scale facility. So when we talk about precision fermentation, this is largely making a protein in yeast species. We largely use yeast. You've got to really be up over about the 100,000 litre sort of scale. And we don't have a facility like that in Australia. We've got a couple of people who might have a 10,000 litre tank, maybe a 20,000 litre tank. So they're trying to get the government to come in and build a large-scale facility up in Queensland, up near they're talking about using sugarcane as the carbon source. So that's sort of happening. But again, if Australia's to be a player, we've got to have a major capital investment. When we make major, we're talking hundreds of millions of dollars for a facility of that nature. What else is happening? They're not really going into the cell-based meat space. I think they've left that alone. I think we've got two companies. We've got Val, and we've also got Magic Farm or Magic Circle.
Magic Valley.
Magic Valley. Don't know too much about Magic Valley, but they're around. We've also got Nourish in Canberra, which is doing fat cells. I quite like that story because a lot of the taste in meat is actually in fat soluble compounds. So I like the Nourish story. It'll be interesting to see where they go. They're doing eat and brew on the dairy side. But again, it'll come down to cost of goods. And my estimates they're a lot closer than cell-based because of the nature of the liquid product. But it's going to be tricky to get near cost. I mean, milk production in Australia, it's about 50 cents a litre. Okay. So, we do it pretty efficiently. The New Zealanders do it even more efficiently. So again, cost will be the issue, and they still got to match taste and texture. All G Foods is doing the same thing. Interesting, with the same technology from Syrup. So that's the other space. About 60% of the companies who around the globe who are in the precision fermentation space are focusing on dairy. Because then if you think about meat, it's a lot more complicated. And the only thing that's happening there is building like a component, like hemoglobin so there's people making some components that you can add to meat products or plant-based products to make them taste like meat. But cost again, unless you get to really high scale.
That's the tricky part. Yeah.
Yeah.
Nice one. Cool. Okay, last question before we wrap. Marianne, I see that you have your hands raised.
Hi, this is what I actually look like. It's the first time putting myself on video.
Hi.
Thank you, Georgia and Paul as well for your answers. And really awesome discussion. I just wanted to ask a question also with waste recycling. Is there a lot of opportunities? Like what kind of food waste can it be used in alternative protein production as well? Do you see opportunities in it, like food source for precision fermentation or byproducts utilized for like plant-based meat or things like that? Is future?
Yeah, look, I think the waste space is really interesting because we waste so much food. You've heard the figures about a third of the food that is wasted, but you've got to understand it's very different in different countries. So largely we waste it in developing countries post the supermarket. So you look at your fridge. You've got a whole lot of product in there that you'll eventually throw out because you didn't get around to eating it, and it's now a limp lettuce or it's a fungal piece of fruit. So that's where we waste, and that stuff's really hard to recycle because it's contaminated with all sorts of others. So unless we change completely our way of transporting that food, yes, I've got a bin outside and I put garbage in one and I put bottles in another and I put cardboard in another, but all the food scraps just go in that general waste bin, and I'm not sorting through all that literally crap. So we're not, we're gonna have to change behaviors if we're going to do that. You're better off putting it in your compost heap at home if you got it, but I live in Fitzroy, a lot of compost heaps in Fitzroy, in apartments. Interestingly, if you think about livestock, they're actually one of the biggest recyclers of food waste, because think about all the crops we grow. We actually only eat a little bit of them. So you grow wheat and we eat those seeds. What happens to the rest of it? So you think of all the crops we grow, the majority of that biomass is actually waste. So at the moment we feed it to livestock, or we put it back into the soil. So livestock are one of the big recyclers of green waste. Insects, yep. So we can do, insects are pretty good. They'll eat anything pretty much, and they're pretty good converters. But again, we've got to get to scale. There's about 8 to 10 sort of insect companies, mostly all doing black soldier flies in Australia. But we're all pretty small in how much waste we can process. But I think that a couple of us will make the scale, and that will be important.
Yeah, I'm super excited about this waste space as well, and perhaps also like excited for Alex's behalf, because he's really into just compost in this. In our previous cohort earlier this year, we went to a waste sorting facility. It blew my mind as well, because apparently it's not even like on a federal regulated level. It's just down to, not even a state as well, it's down to the councils themselves. And they also hire private companies. So it's not something that the government does, rather they contracted these. So I thought that was really interesting, meaning there really isn't I guess like a unification of how processes does. I know in New Zealand, they even recycle different colors of plastic. And then in Taiwan, in kindergarten, we have 7 different recycling bins. But it's just really odd to see such a big waste facility. Essentially what they do is they collect all the compost bins, like the green bins. So I'm in Parkville and we have those, and they have biodegradable, I don't know if it's truly biodegradable, like plastic as well. They dump everything there, and they have a team of like 5 with those, like little pincers to go and actually pull things out. That's how cave stone age tech that they're using, and they're just like, it's just human behavior. We can't do much about it. And as Paul has mentioned, once the contamination hit, we really just can't do much about this as well. So perhaps and also would love to talk a bit, I guess one point that's good to have, not just within cell ag, alt protein as well, but in ag, the challenges, like Georgia has mentioned, is really, really complex. And, like it is kind of like distracting and scary to say, oh, I need to solve this all one giant problem. But no, like we do not, for what we have observed, we'd rather you go and find a small niche on the value chain, on the supply chain. You're not, I guess, meant to try to do an end-to-end. You just offer this particular space, and then together compound that into a greater, I guess, solution. But that is just my observation that sometimes future founders have. It's so scary. Why am I in this? Maybe I'll just go back to my business degree. But that's just a little bit of observations I have. But Georgia,
I should have mentioned the ugly food movement groups. That's really, that's the other thing where we waste. A lot of supermarkets say, I won't take that banana, it doesn't have the right curve, or I won't take that. It's perfectly healthy. So you've got Welly Foods, who I think,
they almost came
with
through.
You guys, there's quite a few companies and even supermarkets who are getting into, like, they have an ugly food section, ugly fruit or something like that, So, so there's, I think, a lot. I think that whole waste piece is a really exciting space.
I would agree, and I will keep this short because I know we're dramatically over time. But I obviously just could talk about this all day. So Marion, if your question, anyone that's interested in exploring the waste space, if you haven't already, definitely explore the National Food Waste Strategy, although it's challenging in itself. I'm not suggesting it's the best strategy. I'm just saying that the data and investigation that's gone behind that piece of work is really illuminating around food waste, and some really interesting like anchor points around food waste data in Australia, but also like keeping a global context, reminding yourself that Australia is a very small market in the global food context. But just, I agree with you, Paul. The data suggests that a lot of food is wasted at a consumer level, but another thing to really be cognizant of is in perishable goods in Australia, there is a big opportunity because having worked for a long time with the horticulture sector, and I know that this applies across other sectors as well, there's a little bit of hedging your bets when it comes to certain products. And so growers will actually often grow more than they have markets for. And that's not in every commodity, but often in the ones that I worked with, depending. Some of the big challenges from a demand creation perspective that we have with those categories is that there was actually more product than there was markets for, which is why you've seen, for example, the rapid decline in cost of avocados as a really good example. We didn't have enough market access, in order to manage the sheer volume of supply that we had coming down the line. And we weren't proactive enough, I guess, in our really establishing long-term robust relationships. And so you're starting to see, obviously, a huge emphasis on that now, but there is a lot of waste on pre-consumer as well in certain industries, which would potentially be opportunities. But I think you just need to be cognizant of the fact that that could change as markets change. So, one day, strawberries, 30% of them get ploughed back in, but that's because we don't have markets for those products. If all of a sudden a market was to open up, or you were to create a solution, one, you could be the beneficiary of that, but also be cognizant of the fact that if the value of that product then goes up because there's another market which is of higher value, then all of a sudden your raw ingredient for your innovation has gone up dramatically in price. So you've got to think about the system at large when you're looking at waste as well. But there are opportunities, I think, beyond just the waste that happens at the consumer level. The Leaf Protein Co is a really good example of that. Marion, if you're interested in exploring technologies and solutions, so there's definitely technologies around fermentation and food processing technologies, extracting high value ingredients from waste products. Like, there's definitely work to be done there. It's just at a whole different level of complexity to manage that supply chain of that raw ingredient, I think, is to exactly what Maxie was sort of alluding to. So take all of that into account. It's still important, though, like when it comes to global distribution of food waste is a real issue, because we actually grow, we are one of the 7, is it, Paul, 7 or 6 countries globally that are actually food net positive. Majority of countries are net importers of food. We're net exporters of food. So we produce more food than we have mouths to feed. So that means our challenge as a country is about markets, finding the markets for our products. And where we don't have markets for our products, that's where we see waste occur. So look for those signals and try and be the market, create the market for that product, and you might be onto a winner. This is it's long and short of it, because I don't want to see all this food go to waste, but you have to create high enough value markets for it. Otherwise, there's actually no value in picking it or harvesting it in the first place.
Yeah, 100%. And also just baffling to me that other countries are fighting food security and we're fighting food waste.
Exactly. So innovations around distribution is interesting. So if you want to come up with one really cool opportunity is looking at really intelligent supply forecasting and demand forecasting for certain commodity groups. So there's a lot of investment going into that space, because if you can be better at predicting what the demand is going to be for a certain product, then you can provide better signals back to the primary producer. Again, we're a long way off that, but that's an exciting opportunity too.
Yeah, and I wonder even if it's some sort of innovative tech that extracts the nutrients somehow and are in a better position to then enter other markets, because it requires less, you just do it here in a plant in Australia, then you export it. Who knows? But Marion or Alex or anyone, if you're keen, Leaf Protein is an alumni of SproutX, and Welly Kids almost came in. They're super lucky. Jared, the founder, found a job where they're like, come and be our head of marketing, and if you come work for us, we'll also support your startup, which is like a dream come true for founders, both sides. You get capital. So happy to do a warm intro if that's something of interest. But yes, I think with that, Georgia, Georgia, Paul, thank you so much for allowing me to go over time. I just feel like it's not enough time to download both of your brains, but so glad to have this opportunity to do so. And we have shared through LinkedIn, so if anyone wants to get in touch with them, definitely just reach out, and or I can also do an email intro as well. But thank you everyone for sticking through. Time to go feed ourselves. But yeah, see you guys. See you guys around. Thank you so much.
Cheers, guys, and don't hesitate to reach out. Always happy to have a chat. And it's a great conversation. It's a really important conversation we continue with.
Important conversation. Yeah,
Yeah.
true that. All
It's
right.
been a pleasure, Paul. Thank you, and lovely to meet you all. Take care and stay in touch if you so wish.
All right. Cheers, guys.
We
Bye.
do wish. Yes. All right. Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.